Far More Than We Think, Making Sense of Spirituality by Angelo. Chapter 31. Evolution of Evolution. One of the common reasons for rejecting spirituality is that it seems to conflict with firmly established scientific principles. Chief among these is the theory of evolution, arising from the landmark publication of Charles Darwin's book on the origin of the species in 1859. The conventional thinking is that evolution provides a scientific alternative to the religious story of creation, and that competition is the driving force of life, as opposed to spiritual principles based on cooperation. At first glance, these conclusions seem so compelling that relatively few of us take the time to consider possible alternatives. The Darwinian theory fits so well with our ideas of the world that it seems beyond reproach. Survival of the fittest is such a well-established fact of life that it makes no sense to question it, and one glance at the dog-eat-dog nature of the world confirms that Darwin was obviously correct in his conclusions. The trouble is, one crucial aspect of Darwin's theory of evolution may well have been mistaken. The widespread belief in this mistake has influenced the thinking and behaviour of countless millions of people for more than 150 years. The Darwinian theory of evolution has had a big impact on evolution itself, and in many respects it has become a self-fulfilling prophecy. A simple rethink of the facts can quickly produce a completely different conclusion. Science has made incredible progress in every imaginable field since 1859, yet the theory of evolution seems not to have evolved at all. It's generally placed in the same category as Newton's discovery of gravity, as one of the known facts of the universe. Well, there's no doubt that evolution exists and is ongoing, but that does not necessarily mean we have a complete understanding of what's happening. Just because a theory seems to explain a phenomenon, this does not mean the theory itself is totally correct. In fact, science is continually revising all sorts of theories as our understanding develops. The acknowledgement that the theory of evolution does not fit with the concept of spirituality must mean that one of these two models for life needs to be revised. It takes just a few minutes of research on the internet to see how a simple philosophical error could have been made by Darwin, and the astonishing impact this has had on today's world. Darwin was not the only one to identify the process of evolution, but it was he who published the definitive work and gained widespread renown. There are several other scientists who undertook research and proposed similar theories in the years preceding 1859. One of these was Alfred Wallace, who wrote a paper in 1858 that Darwin eventually used in his own work. There were many similarities in the thinking of these two men, but the main difference was that Wallace emphasized the impact of the environment in bringing about adaptive mutation, whereas Darwin proposed random mutation based on competition and survival of the fittest. Wallace observed that competition caused the majority to survive at the expense of the weakest, whereas Darwin saw the primary importance of the fittest surviving at the expense of the majority. The two men perceived the same facts from differing political and social positions and reached different conclusions. These differences may seem subtle at first, but the implications are far-reaching. Crucially, it was Darwin who was better connected and had more financial resources, and it was his theory that prevailed. Wallace may well have been more correct, but everyone jumped on the Darwin bandwagon. Wallace's original paper proposed that natural selection was a kind of feedback mechanism that allowed a species to continually adapt to its changing environment. This ties in exactly with the process of adaptive mutation that we covered in the chapter on cells and genes. Darwin chose to prefer his theory that competition was the primary way of selecting the best genes to go forward to the next generation. It's quite possible that Darwin's dogmatic insistence on being right was the single most important event that has shaped the subsequent development of the modern world. The Darwinian view of evolution reinforces the whole idea of fear-based ego. The Darwinian view perpetuates selfishness and the idea that we are all competing for our share of limited resources, and we're constantly fearful that we will lose out, so we often pretend to be other than we really are, so that we're perceived as strong. This fear-based attitude promotes and creates conflict and struggle, and exists everywhere at individual, organizational and national levels. Belief in the survival of the fittest gradually concentrates resources in the hands of the strongest, and so it is that one person metaphorically ends up with 78 slices of pizza out of the 200 available. This model of the world is so ingrained in our cultures that it permeates our subconscious minds long before we are mature enough to even think about it. Consequently, the whole belief system passes from one generation to the next. This belief then reinforces itself because each new generation sees the competitive nature of the world and sets about trying to win its fair share. Any one of us will compete for a scarce resource if we think everyone else is going to hoard it and cause a shortage. The overall truth, however, is that there is no shortage of anything. And despite this universal truth, we are collectively busy depleting and damaging our natural resources and environment at an alarming rate. There should be plenty of pizza for everyone, and it's the ego of humankind itself that is causing the problems. Survival of the fittest means riches for the few and suffering for the rest. If we contrast this state of affairs with Wallace's theory of evolution, we get a completely different picture. For Wallace, the purpose of competition was to maintain the fitness of the majority by weeding out the weaklings. A good modern analogy would be at the heats of an athletics meeting, where the early races are designed not to produce a winner, but to eliminate the slowest in the pack from further participation. In his model, it was the survival of the species that mattered, not just the favoured few. Genetic evolution was the result of the majority adapting to the environment and the minority falling away. This type of behaviour is seen time and time again in the natural world, and there seems far more evidence to support this than there is for Darwin's theory. Cooperation takes place within numerous species and often between different species. The anomaly to this natural process is humankind itself, where we seem to focus on exploitation rather than cooperation. There is some cooperation, of course, but often the agenda is for personal gain or gratification rather than genuine concern for the common good. Based on what we see happening in the world today, it's tempting to discount Wallace's theory as not being appropriate for humankind, but it could easily be argued that we have shaped our own recent evolution by believing in Darwin's theory in the first place. If the Wallace view had been adopted, it's quite possible that our political and economic systems would have developed on a far more cooperative basis. We have instead created our own fear-based reality by adopting the prevailing egocentric beliefs. We've collectively made our bed, and now we have to lie in it. We can't change the past, but we can have a big influence on the future. Collective change will only come about when a critical mass of human beings adopt new beliefs based on spiritual principles. Well, this may happen one day, but meanwhile, all we can do is focus on ourselves. Genetic evolution can take many generations, but personal beliefs can begin to change in the blink of an eye. The Darwinian view has also contributed significantly to the conflict between science and spirituality. Not only does it promote fear in favour of love, it has caused us to place our faith in science rather than spirit. We look to science to solve all our problems, believing in our own ability to force the pace of change, rather than allowing things to proceed more naturally. The popular argument would be that we are improving the quality of life for humankind as a whole, but I'm not so sure. Modern life, based on science and technology, brings us convenience and comfort, but it's come at a very heavy price. I see increasing numbers of humans, but decreasing evidence of humanity. We seem to be creating our own extinction rather than building a beautiful future for our children. Instead of living as love, we are surviving in fear. We reject heaven on earth in favour of creating our collective version of hell. If Wallace was correct that evolution proceeds through adaptive mutation rather than by competition, then we've spent the last 150 years heading in entirely the wrong direction. And I see mounting evidence that this is precisely what's happening. Sooner or later we will need to embrace spirituality so that evolution can lead us back to the more natural path. Darwinism is a philosophical theory rather than a scientific fact. Anyone with an ego mind is likely to accept an ego-based theory rather than a spiritual one. The alternative theories proposed by Darwin and Wallace are the equivalent of the choice that we all face, both individually and collectively. We can either choose fear or we can choose love. We can continue to live in ego or we can embrace spirituality. Humankind is not immune from evolution just because we think we have sophisticated scientific understanding. It's in a time of crisis that evolution kicks in most strongly. Sometimes evolution takes place over very long periods of time, but then suddenly a species will make a leap forwards in response to dramatic environmental change. Sometimes species disappear altogether because they are unable to adapt quickly enough. We know this to be true, yet we assume it cannot possibly happen to us. Well, it can, and it will, and in many respects it's already happening. There is no conflict between evolution and spirituality. The Darwinian theory of evolution simply needs to evolve. Otherwise, evolution may well take matters into its own hands. Humankind is one way in which life has consciously manifested itself in the universe, and evolution is the brilliant mechanism that life uses to drive change. We sometimes tend to think that we are the final product of evolution, but evolution is ongoing. There is nothing more powerful in the universe than life itself, and it makes far more sense to go with the flow of life rather than trying to exploit it to satisfy our own agendas. Life will continue forever, with or without us individually, and with or without this version of civilization. Talking of life continuing forever, this brings us to the next and perhaps most important topic of all. Spirituality tells us that we are body, mind and spirit, and that our individual spirits are part of the whole universal energy of life. The obvious question then arises as to what happens to our spirit energy when the physical body dies. The physical matter contained in our bodies is either eventually recycled as the result of burial in the ground, or quickly turned back into energy through incineration. The common belief in all branches of spirituality, dating from today all the way back to ancient times, is that spirit energy returns to its source and is then available to remain there or recycle back through another incarnation of physical life. This whole question of life after death is obviously impossible to prove scientifically. We can't possibly know what happens for sure until we die, and then it's too late to provide any evidence. There is, however, a wealth of anecdotal evidence arising from stories of near-death experiences. And of course there is the world-famous religious story of resurrection from 2,000 years ago. Ultimately, though, it all comes down to personal belief. My views have changed from complete disbelief in eternal life to total certainty, all as the result of the spiritual awakening that I've experienced. And since then there's been one particular story published by Dr. Eben Alexander in his book Proof of Heaven, which I believe to be very credible and which adds real weight to the body of evidence which supports the distinct existence of spirit. It may not be scientific evidence, but it seems to be the closest that we've come so far. The next chapter summarizes the story as I understand it.